Thank you, Colin. Well, these are your latest headlines. Former Tory Cabinet Minister Owen Paterson through a Commons vote. The Standards Committee had recommended a 30-day ban for breaching lobbying on the rules surrounding parliamentary. Labour Deputy Leader Angela Rayner has described the result as a disgrace. The British skipper caught up in the post-Brexit fishing row has been told he can leave France immediately. A French court has also ruled the captain of the Scottish trawler does not have to pay a deposit for the release of his boat. Authorities had demanded he pay a bond of more than £120,000. The head of South Western Rail has praised the driver involved in a collision near Salisbury on Sunday, saying his actions prevented a much more serious incident. Managing Director Claire Mann says the driver, who remains in hospital, reacted correctly under the circumstances. Investigators say the train ran 220 metres past a red signal before hitting another train. The driver attempted to apply the brakes, but the wheels slipped on the tracks and the train didn't stop as it should. The UK's financial companies have been given 2 years to submit their plans to achieve net zero targets. The Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, told the COP26 conference they'll be checked against standards set out by green industry leaders. He says the role financial firms play will be vital in tackling climate change. Football fans have been paying their respects to former Scotland boss Walter Smith in Glasgow. Thousands of people gathered outside the Ibrox Stadium to see the funeral cortege. The ex-Rangers and Everton manager died last week at the age of 73. The number of migrants crossing the English Channel has topped 20,000 this year. That's double the total for the whole of 2020. Today, UK authorities rescued or intercepted over 800 people who'd navigated busy shipping lanes. And Prince Charles and Leonardo DiCaprio have met at an eco-fashion collection at COP26. The two environmental campaigners viewed the designer Stella McCartney's sustainable clothes and accessories. Well, that's all for now. You're right up to date. Now it's back to Brazier.
Forget what you know about illegal migration into Britain. The pictures do not change, it's true. The same anonymous figures bunched together on lifeboats heading into Kentish harbours. But just because it feels like the images are on a loop doesn't mean the facts are not evolving, and quickly. Tonight, officials are reporting another 24 boats at least have crossed the Channel, bearing perhaps another 600 illegal migrants into an asylum system that is unlikely to see them processed rapidly or indeed repatriated. In recent days, we passed a milestone that would have seemed utterly unthinkable only a couple of years ago. Then, illegal boat crossings by asylum seekers was something that happened to other countries, on other coastlines, on other seas, the Aegean and the Mediterranean, not here. But it's happening now, and in numbers. A new annual record, more than 21,000 and counting, and there are still 2 months left of the year. Today, there were dozens of boats bearing well over 800 illegals. Time was when it was thought boats couldn't cross in November, but this is, as I say, a story that is changing all the time, for all that the images appear not to. For one thing, the boats are getting bigger. People smugglers increasingly employ the longer inflatable boats used by migrants leaving Africa for Europe. Privately, officials point to exponential projections. 20,000 might look modest and manageable compared to what's coming. One thing, however, is not changing: the people on board. A Home Office official said this week that 87% of those arriving in boats across the Channel were men aged between 18 and 39. We have no way of knowing who they are or why they want to be here. Many destroy their papers but arrive hoping to join a diaspora that will help them find their feet. They may land on the beaches, but they are bound for the hinterland, often for communities which are already sometimes struggling to resolve existing problems of assimilation. And when the numbers are this large, it's a reasonable assumption that a handful arrive who the security services would rather had not. The solution, that lies in French cooperation, but in the week that Emmanuel Macron left COP26 early and is seething about fishing quotas, what are the chances of that? Well, let's turn to our home and security editor, Mark White, who is with me. Mark, we were just talking about some nighttime pictures. We may be able to play them in if the system works in time. But the point is, there are lifeboat crews at the moment who are working pretty much round the clock intercepting these vessels.
The Dungeness lifeboat was called out at 2 a.m. to reports of a boat in trouble off the coast. That was the first call of the day. It's been out more than half a dozen times. The latest call came about 6 o'clock in the evening. It's gone now off Hastings and is involved in that rescue. In the meantime, the Dover lifeboat has just come back into Dover Harbour. It had been off the coast. There you see the very latest pictures of that vessel coming back in. We understand there are 30 people at least on board that. They were pulled off a small boat about 10 miles off St Margaret's Bay this evening. It as well has been out more than half a dozen times, the Dover lifeboat. Ramsgate, that vessel was out. It came into harbour with more than 80 migrants at one point today. In addition to that, you've got Border Force who've been out as well. They've been out in 4 of their boats, a cutter and 3 other Border Force vessels out there intercepting these vessels. We understand that actually 30 boats have been intercepted on the British side of the waters. There are also some boats that have been intercepted by the French in French waters and turned back, as was the picture yesterday. But actually the majority do get through and over to the UK.
These numbers, which, you know, when we look at the projections, I know privately people are talking about tens of thousands more in the next calendar year, 21,000, maybe 22,000, possibly a bit higher, maybe 25,000 by the end of this year, possibly double or triple that by next year, and who knows what beyond then. It's the rate of increase that's got to have people like Priti Patel worried.
They are worried, and it's a model that's working. That's why they're worried, because when you had the model of, and you still have that to an extent, of migrants in the back of lorries. In fact, on the M25 earlier today, 5 migrants were pulled out of the back of a refrigerated lorry and treated for hypothermia. So that is still going on. But to a lesser degree than it was a few years ago, when we saw all of those pictures out of Calais of lots of migrants trying to get onto the backs of lorries. Then they really upped the game at the port of Calais to try to ensure that, you know, they put these probes in, testing for carbon dioxide and things like that in the air in the back of these lorries. They had X-ray vision. They were able to pluck quite a few of the migrants off these lorries, and they were then basically being put off that route. They were trying again and being caught, and some got through, but a lot didn't. However, this route through the Channel, yes, some are being turned back in France, but they're doing like they did with the lorries, and they're trying again. And at some point they get through, because all they need to do really is to get far enough off the shore so they can't safely be turned back by the French. Then they tell the French, according to the French, that if you try to intercept us and push us back, we will jump into the water. So the French then escort these vessels into British waters, and the British have no choice then but to receive them and take them to Dover or whichever port they are nearby at that stage. Britain wants to adopt a process of trying to turn back some of the vessels, but that, I mean, it will work in a tiny proportion of the incidents. They would have to be all male, for instance. It would never do it with women and children on board. It would have to be a sturdy enough vessel. Well, these vessels aren't that sturdy. And it would have to be in a state, in other words, not overpacked with migrants. So what are the migrants going to do? They're going to make sure that they overpack them. They're going to put some women and children in there for good measure. And they are going to be in increasingly flimsy boats, which we're seeing. The longer, 11-metre long boats. There was 86 migrants pulled off one of those boats in the English Channel in recent weeks. You can see where this is heading, Colin.
And you're saying, in a word, Mark, this is insoluble unless you get ironclad French cooperation.
French cooperation, and also going after the operation to sell these boats and engines to the traffickers in the first place. Go after it at source.
Mark, thanks very much indeed. Mark White. Well, let's turn to the Paris correspondent and journalist Peter Allen, who joins us now. Peter, thanks ever so much for your time. We were just talking there about the French connection in all this, and you'd have to say relying on French goodwill right now if you're in Whitehall is not something you can absolutely depend upon. There's a French presidential election in April next year, and the idea of bashing the Brits might be quite appealing electorally.
Yes, I think you're probably right there, Colin. It's not a great time. Remember, this whole issue of immigration from France into Britain has been going on for decades now. It's the same old problem. It's getting worse, as you've outlined in your programme tonight. But I think the French attitude broadly is the same as it has been for many, many years. And that is to say that it is a country of immigration. It does welcome immigrants. But what can it do with immigrants who don't want to stay in France? They can't lock them up. They can't. It's very, very hard to deport them. A few years ago, there was, I remember well, the French police used to put failed immigrants to Britain in coaches and drive them to Belgium, believe it or not. Of course, they were back within a few hours. Again, that is the problem. They can increase security around Calais, which they've done year after year, and millions is going into securing Calais, and a lot of that money, of course, comes from the British. But in the end, if you're determined and you want to get to Britain to test your asylum application, you can do it. Evidently, that's the case. And as you say, Colin, the situation is probably going to get worse over the months to come. We have, look at just the situation in Afghanistan, for example. Paris is full of young Afghans who coming from a failed country who want to go to Britain.
Yeah, I think my point, Peter, is it's the quantum and it's the sharpness of the increase on the graph. I mean, as you say, this has been going on for years. I've seen Mark White, our home editor, just there talking about some of the devices put in place at Calais. I've seen them myself. You probably have as well. I remember sitting through press conferences as far back as people like Nicolas Sarkozy when he was the French Interior Minister alongside a youthful-looking David Blunkett and how they were going to solve the problems of the Songat camp. That feels like eons ago. But the truth is, as Mark makes clear there a moment ago, that was lorries. There was a sort of limit. There was a cap, effectively, and practically put on the numbers who could make it across. That cap seems to have been totally removed by what's happening now.
Yes, that's quite true. Again, you're dealing with such... everybody thinks everything is coming out of Calais, for example. It really isn't. A lot of the boats are setting off from a massive stretch of coastline. All of us look at these maps of the British coastline and the French coastline, and we think, well, look, perhaps you could put legions of police here and barbed wire here, whatever. But of course, you can't. You know, France is a free country. People can walk along the coastline. They can launch boats as they want. And of course, once the boats are launched, it's very, very difficult for anybody to do anything. And again, I wouldn't want to be somebody who's defending the French approach to it all. As you say, Colin, there's lots of problems between France and Britain at the moment, and there would be an argument to say that a lot of French politicians and members of the public would be more than happy to see immigrants travelling over to Britain rather than staying in France. There's no doubt about that at all. The country is...
Peter, just on that point, I mean, I agree with you. There's no doubt about that at all, except that when we listen to some of the rhetoric coming out of the mouths of people like Eric Zemmour, hardline rightists, but even people like Michel Barnier, and both of them effectively calling for referenda on immigration, is it not the case that actually it's in the UK's interest in terms of stemming the migratory flows for somebody more of the right to get into the Elysee Palace, because they will at least seal off to some degree France's borders, and if fewer of those, for instance, Afghans you mentioned earlier, are coming into France, they can't transit France to then get into the UK. Yes, they may find other ways through Belgium, for instance, but the main route from France will be cut off.
Well, that's a very, very good way of looking at it, interesting way of looking at it. And you're quite right. The next election is undoubtedly going to be fought on the right, on the nationalist vote, on the vote that says that the French are very, very unhappy with the amount of immigration coming into the country. And absolutely, if you got a very, very right-wing candidate, or even a not so right-wing candidate, I mean, look at the Gaullists. They want to win the election. The Conservatives, the Republicans, as they're called now, they would certainly echo what you've just said, Colin. And even Emmanuel Macron. I mean, Macron is certainly pushing to the right, and he's somebody who is listening to French people who think that something urgently needs to be done. So I would agree with you. I think this upcoming election is going to be extremely interesting. Will there be a change? I don't think there's probably going to be a change of president, but there may be a change of policy after this election once the electors have spoken, certainly in the first round, and their concerns have been heard, Colin.
Well, we're watching that electoral process really closely, Peter, and I'm sure we'll get to talk to you about it in the months to come. For now, thanks very much indeed. Now, a man labelled Britain's strictest head teacher has urged more parents to tackle delinquent behaviour. This is Barry Smith, earned a reputation as a school head who takes discipline very seriously. He turned around a failing school with a regime that included things like calling children in detention detainees. He once handed out 80 detentions in a school day. He put a bucket in the corner of the classroom so the kids who felt sick or said they felt sick could stay in their lessons rather than go home. You start to get the picture of the type of person we're talking about. Well, speaking to today's Sun, Mr. Smith said, "We live in a society that thinks stricter is negative. Teachers are abused on a daily basis. Often adults are afraid of children." Effectively. Well, it's an interesting philosophy and one doubtless many of you will agree with. I know I do. But as we look to invite a commentator to discuss this topic, how easy or otherwise it is for adults to call out bad behaviour in younger folk, we saw a story which really underlines why it is that quite so many adults are reluctant to publicly challenge antisocial behaviour when it happens to them or around them. Have a look at this footage released today by Hampshire Police. CCTV shows a cyclist getting off his bike after an 83-year-old man told him not to ride it on the pavement. It was 6:35 in the morning, so nobody's been out on the lash, not late at night, nor was it a troubled inner city. This was happening on Hightown Road. It's in Ringwood, on the edge of the very picturesque New Forest. So should you have a go and be a hero, or walk on by and perhaps arguably be part of the problem? Joining me, former senior police officer Peter Kirkham. Peter, thanks ever so much for joining us. It's nice to have you on the show again. It's eternal dilemma, really, isn't it? I mean, there was a fascinating piece by Nick Timothy, formerly Theresa May's advisor, a while ago, and he was drawing attention to a situation that unfolded within the last year at a supermarket in South London where half a dozen young people were effectively running riot, and there were a few people filming them. Nobody had a go, and he said actually it's easy to blame those bystanders who didn't intervene, but in a world where you don't know who's carrying a knife, is it worth the candle?
It's something that you've got to assess the risk of yourself in the precise circumstances that you face, and if you are of the opinion that you are in danger or others are in danger of significant injury if you intervene, then it would be unwise to intervene because all you're going to do is add to the problem and provide another casualty. But I can't tell you whether in any particular set of circumstances, any situation, it would be good to intervene or it wouldn't be good to intervene, because some days in some sets of precise circumstances it would be one thing, and in some days with different circumstances it would be the other.
And sometimes, there isn't time actually for a considered decision, Peter. I mean, I didn't forget the chance to play those pictures in again from Ringwood, but it's over in a flash. I mean, even if, perhaps as a bystander, if you'd seen this, if you were driving by in your car on your way to work and you saw this happen, you don't really know what's going on. I mean, you're going to hopefully get out of your car and help the 83-year-old man who's just hit the deck and is clearly in some distress. You may think twice about whether you can catch up with the lad on his bike. But these are decisions on an instant, aren't they? And I suppose, in a sense, what we ought to reflect on as well, looking again at those pictures, is if you're the young lad who's done this, it's an 83-year-old man hitting the deck with some force, hitting the ground with some force. Before you know it, you could be up for manslaughter.
You could, but equally, if perchance with goodwill the injuries are minor, bruises and such like, then you could end up with someone being prosecuted for common assault. Now, in terms of the law of assault, yes, the charge is going to be based, broadly speaking, on the seriousness of the injury. But, and it's a big but, sentencing policy for lesser actual injuries could and should be considered in the light of what might have happened if there was an intent to cause a more serious injury. Then that might mean there's another charge available. It might not. Depends again on the precise circumstances. But that should be an aggravating factor against the relatively low sentence for a minor crime because the injuries were low level. But that was by luck, not judgment, and therefore the act needs to be punished greater than is merited by the actual injury. So it needs to be built in as far more of an aggravating factor for a more minor charge.
Can I come back to what this head teacher had to say, which was actually much more low level? It was more like that old policy of broken windows in New York, which was famous,
Exactly.
much talked of for a while. This idea that, you don't get so far as deciding whether you need to intervene because you've seen an 83-year-old man pushed to the ground and maybe seriously injured. You intervene when you see a 13-year-old drop some litter or something pretty, or spray something on a wall. That's the moment you say something and do something, because in introducing a sense of collective responsibility and even collective parenting into civil society, you stop these problems before they become bigger.
Well, that is the hope, and that is what large parts of the police service and other parts of the criminal justice system are set up to do. The whole youth justice system is intended to divert from further offending one way or another. And so it's a preventative sentencing regime for juveniles, not so much for adults. But whether it's a deterrent or whether there's some effective treatment or training or whatever it might be that's needed, it doesn't really matter if it reduces offending by them and others in the future. The reduction of offending has got to be the key driver of the criminal justice system and sentencing policy.
Peter, got to leave it there. Peter Kirkham, thanks for your time. Thanks a lot. After the break, an Indigenous peoples campaigner has been outed in Canada as a white European. Mark Stein will be joining us.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else. I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News.
Join us for Political Correction. We're here every Sunday to correct politics and put you, the people, back in charge.
We talk about all areas of the United Kingdom, including Northern Ireland.
Our debate goes way beyond the Westminster Village. It's about the real country. It's about your opinion. So please, we want you to tell us what you think.
This is Political Correction.
Every Sunday morning from 10 a.m. here on GB News.
Hi, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
And we're hosting a show right here on GB News, 9:30 a.m. till 12 p.m. every single weekday. Call to the point.
We're going to be talking about all the big issues that matter to you at home in Britain.
Absolutely, whether it's holding politicians to account, discussing what's taking place in the Channel, banging on about law and order, we're not afraid to do the absolute lot of it.
Yes, and if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we'll be saying it.
Make sure you're here 9:30 a.m. till 12 p.m. every single weekday right here on GB News for To The Point.
Well, it's happened again. A crusader for minority rights has been exposed as a diversity charlatan, a sort of ethnic imposter. Carrie Bourassa is the name this time. She's 48 and a university professor in Canada, where she made much of her Indigenous heritage. Bourassa, dressed in a blue shawl, carried a feather and went by the native name Morning Star Bear. She appeared at conferences and said she was guided by the spirits of her Indigenous ancestors. The only problem was she was talking out of her wigwam. The truth is that her heritage was much like that of other European immigrants. Morning Star Bear family, the Morning Star Bears family, were not from the Great Prairies, but from Poland, Russia, and Czechoslovakia. She's been publicly shamed and forced to stand down from a job giving health advice to Indigenous Canadians. Well, we've been here before. President Trump never tired of teasing his Democratic rival, Elizabeth Warren, who claimed native Cherokee heritage and repeatedly referenced her roots when campaigning. This was President Trump in 2017 telling ever so slightly bemused Native American veterans about his nickname for Warren.
And I just want to thank you because you're very, very special people. You were here long before any of us were here. Although we have a representative in Congress who they say was here a long time ago. They call her Pocahontas. But you know what? I like you.
Oh, the good old days. Well, when pressed, Elizabeth Warren couldn't produce evidence of her non-whiteness. Eventually, she released a DNA test that hinted at a distant Native American ancestor, possibly from 10 generations ago. Other campaigners have passed themselves off, not as Native Americans, but as African Americans. Rachel Dolezal claimed to be a black woman and became a civil rights activist, working as a regional president of the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People. You may remember this story. She was forced to resign in 2015 after she was outed, effectively, by her white parents. Well, it's not just North Americans who fall foul of ethnic imposter syndrome. Just this weekend, a British pop star, Jessie Nelson, formerly of the band Little Mix, not entirely familiar with most of their back catalogue, but I'm told they're quite good, was criticised by her former bandmates. Nelson stands accused of a newly minted woke transgression called blackfishing. She wears braids and fake tan, enough for some fans to assume she was mixed race, which she isn't, by the way, she's white. One of her seemingly embittered former bandmates, Lee Ann Pinnock, explained to The Telegraph, capitalising on aspects of blackness without having to endure the daily realities of the black experience is problematic and harmful to people of colour. Well, according to this analysis, a white person pretending to be black is, to use that most menacingly vague accusations of woke theology, problematic. Well, it might be, but not necessarily for the reason Ms. Leanne Pinnock suggests, because there's a logic gap here, and you may have spotted it. If white privilege is so all-pervasive, why do some white people seem reluctant to embrace that whiteness? Surely being black in a world of white privilege confers no conceivable advantages, except that it can do. A recent survey from the United States suggested that a third of white students had falsely claimed they belonged to a racial minority when applying for college places and university grants. More than half of white students claimed to be Native American, while a substantial minority pretended effectively to be Latino. And for most of them, the lie worked. 3/4 of applications from white students falsely claiming to be non-white were successful. This is, by the way, of course, not to deny that the world does harbour racists. Of course, they're out there, racism exists, but it is to wonder out loud whether it's always such a one-way street of disadvantage. That's the Brazier angle. Delighted to say we're joined now by the author and broadcaster Mark Stein. Mark, ever so good of you to join us this evening. Very nice to see you. Tell us about Carrie Bourassa. I hope I'm pronouncing her surname correctly, but she tends to go by another name.
Yes, and what's interesting, the examples you cited there, she is merely the latest of what we might call the flight from white, which I can well understand. It's if you're told, as we are told constantly, about white privilege and systemic racism, it's either kind of shameful or embarrassing or just merely socially rather tedious to be white, which is why we have all these perfectly white people now pretending to be something other than what they are. Carrie Brazier is pretending, I think she pretended to be an Algonquin Indian, and more than that, once you go down this path and you pretend to be an Indian or you pretend to be black like Rachel Dolezal, you don't just say, okay, I used to be a white dentist and now I'm going to be an Algonquin Indian dentist. They actually became activists and, as it were, racial grievance mongers. So people are adopting these identities in order that they can join the victim class instead of being in the alleged oppressor class. You were rather kind to Elizabeth Warren when you said she may have had some Indian ancestry. She claimed to be a Cherokee. She was, in fact, 1024th, according to the DNA test, 1024th a person of colour. Justin Trudeau can actually be genetically more a person of colour than that just by getting out the old Kiwi shoe polish and sticking it on his face. So we're dealing with a very strange psychological moment in which people have so internalized all this rubbish about systemic racism and white privilege that they don't want to be white and they'll take whatever's out there.
Well, you can see why it works on the sort of ad hoc one-off bases. You know, you've got these individuals who see that there are certain advantages that are conferred on them if they claim a particular type of heritage. Where I think it's possibly arguably more troubling is when it seems industrialised and indeed sort of put in reverse. So you've got this extraordinary survey from the States saying that there is really widespread duplicity on the parts of white students who realise the system is gamed against them in a sense and say to themselves, well, we're going to play the game too. You know, when it comes to ticking that box marked ethnicity, they're just not so openly, quietly lying and cashing in when it comes to scholarships and grants and college places.
Well, they're not really cashing in. They're trying to overcome the so-called affirmative action that discriminates against them. I mean, I've been advising young American high school students for decades now just to claim to be, something in the Elizabeth Warren realm, not to claim to be something like 1/16th Indian or 1/16th Latino, because it's like just far enough back that makes it hard to trace. But otherwise, I happen to be an Irish, Belgian, Canadian. I didn't ask to be born that way, and it happens that there are three loser categories that are useless if you want to get into Harvard and Yale. So it's perfectly reasonable, I think, that the establishment has incentivized this form. Harvard, for example, Harvard Law School promoted Elizabeth Warren as its first so-called woman of color. Now, my old joke about Elizabeth Warren is that she's the whitest, I think that I used to say the whitest white since Frosty the Snowman fell in a vat of Tippex. She's whiter than anything you've ever seen. And yet, when she was promoted as Harvard Law School's first woman of color, nobody laughed. Again, like this lady in Canada, she became a professional Indian, as it were. She submitted a native Cherokee recipe to the Pow Wow Chow cookbook. And it turned out that her native Cherokee recipe, it was a crab and tomato dish, for which the Cherokee are renowned. It was, in fact, from a Midtown restaurant in Manhattan from the mid-20th century, where it was a favorite dish of the great Broadway composer Cole Porter and the late Duke of Windsor, which would mean the Duke of Windsor was a Cherokee, which would mean Her Majesty the Queen is a Cherokee, which would mean that the best way to end the centuries of American racism would be to destroy the monarchy. This is the logic of the insane world we live in.
And it's a logic that seems, by your lights, Mark, to say that what matters first and foremost is your lived experience. If you feel you're secretly Somalian, then Somalian you kind of are. And yet, isn't the trend perhaps that just beginning to go in the opposite direction? Is that these people are being found out, and when they are found out, it's as we saw in that clip from President Bush, you become a figure of fun.
Well, I think up to a point. The interesting thing is that Elizabeth Warren was not laughed out of electoral politics for passing herself off as Cherokee for decades. The same thing looks like happening to Madame Bourassa in Canada. A lot of people are rallying around her. And it's interesting to me, for example, if I were to write a novel from the perspective of an Algonquin Indian, I would be accused of cultural appropriation, and half the interns at the publishing house would demand the book be pulped. But on the other hand, so that's if I write a book from the perspective of an Algonquin Indian. But on the other hand, if I were to actually say, hey, I am Algonquin Indian, and adopt some, Indian name straight out of some pathetic Disneyfied Indian princess movie, as this lady has done, if I was actually to purport to be an Indian chief or an Indian maiden, people would be far more forgiving than if I just, as I said, wrote a novel with an Indian character. You can self-identify. If you, Colin, decide tomorrow, you wake up tomorrow and you decide you're a woman, we will all accept that. And heaven help anyone who mispronouns you. But we haven't quite got there yet on race. And once we do, once it's as easy to transition racially as it is in terms of your sex, then I think there's going to be very few white people left in the world. Because who wants to be the last oppressor? There's going to be a 97-year-old guy. A 97-year-old guy somewhere in the middle of New Zealand who will be the last white oppressor on the planet, and every other white person will be pretending to be an Abenaki Indian.
Fantastic. Mark, it's lovely to talk to you. Nearly got through it with a straight face. Mark Stein, thanks a lot. Coming up later, another embarrassment for Joe Biden after a surprise Republican win on his doorstep.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panelists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else. I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News.
Join us for Political Correction. We're here every Sunday to correct politics and put you, the people, back in charge.
We talk about all areas of the United Kingdom, including Northern Ireland.
Our debate goes way beyond the Westminster Village. It's about the real country. It's about your opinion. So please, we want you to tell us what you think.
This is Political Correction.
Every Sunday morning from 10 a.m. here on GB News.
Hi, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
And we're hosting a show right here on GB News, 9:30am till 12pm, every single weekday. Call to the point.
We're going to be talking about all the big issues that matter to you at home in Britain.
Absolutely, whether it's holding politicians to account, discussing what's taking place in the Channel, banging on about law and order, we're not afraid to do the absolute lot of it.
Yes, and if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we'll be saying it.
Make sure you're here 9:30am till 12pm, every single weekday, right here on GB News, for To the Point.
Now, a dozen trans prisoners convicted of violence or sexual crimes have been sent to Scottish women's jails within the last year and a half, so say figures released under Freedom of Information laws. Of the 12, one of the inmates had transitioned from male to female, while the other 11 were still self-identifying as female. Critics of the policy say that vulnerable female prisoners, some of whom have suffered domestic violence at the hands of men, are traumatised afresh by coming into contact with inmates who self-identify as women, but who are in fact, and this is the crucial fact, in fact still biologically male. Let's turn to Andrew Doyle, who joins us now. Andrew, hi to you. This is one of the thorniest questions for people who are grappling with a question which for many of them remains deeply abstract and something which belongs in the ivory towers of academia or sometimes, you know, on the lips of free speech campaigners like yourself. But actually this idea of people who are identifying as women but are biologically still male in a woman's prison does exercise minds.
Yes, this is one of those areas that gender-critical feminists have been keen to focus on. When you have a system of gender self-identification where you can simply declare to be the opposite sex, then feminists would argue, and campaigners have argued, that this puts women at risk. It is a safeguarding issue when it comes to places such as domestic violence, refuge centres, changing facilities, toilets, that kind of thing, and accommodation in hospitals as well, for instance, but also prisons, crucially prisons. And so this has become an important debating point. And increasingly, prisons are not requiring a gender recognition certificate in order to transfer. In other words, a prisoner can identify as a male-bodied prisoner can identify as female and be transferred. And this story shows that it is actually happening. Now, it's a very sensitive area. It's a very tricky place to delve into, but I think it is important. There's a really interesting book by Helen Joyce called Trans, When Ideology Meets Reality. And she discusses the issue of prisons. And she quotes a very important statistic, which is that of the 125 transgender prisoners known to be in prisons in England in 2017, 60 of those were trans women who had been convicted of sexual assault. So that's around 50%. That's considerably higher than the male prison population, which comes at roughly 19%. Now, she's really at pains to point out this is not to suggest that trans people have a higher propensity for sexual assault. That is a myth, and trans campaigners are right to be wary of people propagating this myth that trans people are more likely to be predators. As Helen Joyce points out, what this suggests is that gender self-identification can provide a kind of cover for predators. So, in other words, someone who isn't trans can identify as the other gender to gain access to spaces. And it has happened. And we have had people being transferred and then going on to commit sexual assault within prison. So it is a problem. And we shouldn't be thinking that just because this is a sensitive area, we shouldn't discuss it, because women are actually at risk of sexual assault in these circumstances.
Well, it certainly feels for something this serious, Andrew, that those gender recognition certificates ought to be the bare evidential bar that if somebody wants to move from a man's prison to a woman's prison and be an inmate there, they need to demonstrate clinically and psychologically that they deserve to be there. What is the bar for that certificate? What do you need to demonstrate? Who is doing the proving?
Well, this is the big debate that's going on at the moment, is that trans activists want it to be the case that you can simply self-ID and then that is an automatic procedure that happens. At the moment, there's more to it than that. In this case, I think it is 11 out of the 12 prisoners in this particular case hadn't actually transitioned. It was just simply a matter of self-identification without the certificate. But there's a whole procedure that people go through. And, you know, to sort of skip over that process does raise some questions. I mean, a very good example of this is quite a famous example, actually. Back in 2017, I think it was the case of Stephen Wood, who transitioned or self-identified, became Karen White, was transferred to a female prison and assaulted 4 inmates, and then was transferred back to the male prison. So we can see how it does actually happen. It's not one of these things where we can say it might potentially happen in the future. Although even if that were the case, that would be something worth considering, because when it comes to safeguarding, you are anticipating things that might go wrong. It's no good sort of saying, well, we should have implemented these policies earlier once the crime has taken place. So it is a thorny debate, and it comes down to this point of, should certain bodies and institutions be recording biological sex rather than gender identity? It's not just prisons; it's also the NHS, for instance. It's actually quite important in some circumstances that these institutions know your biological sex, and people could be left to identify however they please and live whatever lives they want. When it comes to prisons, it's slightly harder, and so some people have suggested maybe we need a trans wing, or a wing for people who are in that process of transition or who want to be known as their gender identity, not their biological sex. That's one potential way around it.
Yeah, you can see why that would cause difficulties for some, can't you? Andrew, thanks very much indeed. Andrew Doyle. Well, Joe Biden may have nodded off during COP in Glasgow, but he's had a nasty wake-up call on his return to the US. The extent of his domestic unpopularity laid bare by an unexpected defeat in Virginia and a vote for the governorship in New Jersey that's also looking like going potentially at least the way of the Republicans. We're not quite sure yet. That would be a real shock in a state that's been reliably Democrat for some years now. In Virginia, a state won by Biden in 2020 by some 10 points, a Republican political novice, Glenn Youngkin, has ousted the Democratic former state governor, Terry McAuliffe, and there could be more pain for the party, as I say, within the next few hours. Last year, Joe Biden took New Jersey by 16%, but tonight the polls there seem to be tightening, and it's possible the incumbent governor, that's Philip D. Murphy, could lose to a largely unknown Republican called Jack Ciattarelli. Donald Trump said the results so far were a victory for his supporters. Why is he saying that? Well, Greg Swenson is from the group Republicans Overseas, joins us here in the studio, I'm delighted to say. Greg, thanks for coming in.
Great.
Why is that? Before we get to the individual races, we have to start with that end point there that Donald Trump is sort of claiming this as a victory for himself and his base.
I mean, there's a certain amount of truth to that in the sense that Trump, especially in Virginia, endorsed Youngkin, even though Youngkin didn't sort of reach out to Trump. He didn't ask him to campaign for him. But I think that the suburban and actually the more rural voters came out for Youngkin, and those are the real Trump supporters. So I think Youngkin managed it perfectly, and I think Trump's endorsement surely helped him, and I don't think he could have won without it. Is it 100% Trump? Of course not.
Yeah, I mean, Virginia's one of those places that, when we think back to election time here in the UK, suddenly we all became experts in this cephology of American states and which way they're going. Are they getting redder? Are they getting bluer? And this has been becoming a more Democrat state, hasn't it?
Without a doubt. And look, I'm thrilled with the result from last night, and it's an indication that local issues matter. All politics is local, as the great Democrat Tip O'Neill said. And these issues are important, and that's what won the election. But it's also a rejection of Biden to a certain degree. But I have to, remember that it is trending blue. When the last Republican that won the governor's mansion in Virginia was Bill McConnell in 2009. Also, a complete rejection of the Obama policy and Obama's first year in office. But he won by 19 points. So the state's really changed. So I don't think this is a long-term, absolute victory. Virginia is red again. I don't think that's the case. But it is a complete rejection of Biden's administration and an understanding, and I think the Democrats won't admit this, but I think it's important to acknowledge that local issues, schools, parents' issues are really important.
What's your sense of what's happening in New Jersey, and does it matter so much in the sense that if it's two votes that go against Biden, that feels like a trend rather than a one-off and a blip?
It's definitely a trend because, again, there's some history to this. It happened to Bill Clinton in '93. It happened to Obama in 2009 when both New Jersey and Virginia went to Republicans, which again is unusual, at least in New Jersey's case, but it's definitely unusual for Virginia now, and that's important to keep in mind. But I don't think that this is the end of the Democrats in Virginia, but they should be very scared about New Jersey because, as you pointed out in the introduction, Colin, this is a Democratic state. Biden won by 16 points, so for a massive swing like that, from 16 to a virtual tie, and then in Virginia from +10 to -2. This is something that the Democrats really should pay attention to.
I mean, look, as a Republican, you're not here to be a cheerleader for the Democrats, obviously. Sure. But are you surprised by the speed with which Biden's popularity has plummeted? And could you identify any one thing?
I don't know that I could identify one. I think the problem for Biden, and I am definitely surprised by the speed. I mean, I was skeptical, but I couldn't have predicted this. It's really 5 or 6 things. And these are, interestingly enough, they're issues that are really important to voters and to people, but the progressive left and the sort of elites in the Democratic Party have no concept of that. There's a huge disconnect between the leaders of the party and the administration right now versus the voters. And that's the craze. But it's the economy and inflation. That's relatively new. The economy and inflation is now the most important issue to 53% of Americans. No other issue polls above 50. They're all in the 30s or 40s. Climate change is at 35. This is not Europe, okay? Yeah. And so economy, inflation, crime, the border, Afghanistan, COVID, there's a long list, and he's polling in the 20s and 30s on all of them. So this is not a good moment for Biden. We saw this with Clinton and Obama, and you saw huge swings in the midterms after both of those administrations' first years in '94 and 2010. But he doesn't have the political gifts of Clinton and Obama. So I don't think he bounces back from this. And he's not going to pivot to the middle like Clinton did, and he doesn't have the talent that Obama did.
There's one political gift he doesn't have, and that's the ability to make people giggle. We just had a clip of him doing the famous Pocahontas reference with the Native American whisperers in the White House, and I haven't chuckled at Joe Biden, but there he is. Whatever else you think of him,
it's a tough sell.
Greg, thanks very much.
Great to be here. Thanks, Colin.
Thanks a lot. Now, the go-ahead has been given to what could be, the tallest sculpture in Britain at 3 times the height of the Angel of the North. The sculpture, it's to be in rural Northumberland, will be a tribute to the Queen. It's going ahead in spite of a decision by Northumberland County Council to block its erection near the village of Kirkwelpington. That decision was subsequently overturned on appeal. The sculpture, let's show you an image, there it is, quite unusual. It's called Ascendant. It will cost £3 million and will be on land owned by Viscount Devonport, who's a retired architect, amongst other things. The design, I think you'll agree, is pretty abstract. A thin metal spike protruding from the ground to make it look as if a thin slice of the hill on which it's situated has been removed. Well, it's been designed by the artist Simon Hitchens, who I'm delighted to say joins me now. Simon Hitchens, thanks ever so much for your time. Let's talk about the design first. It's striking, it's different. What are you trying to say?
Golly, many things. So it references the local geology, the history of steel production. Also, Charles Parsons, who is a former owner of the rare estate and who famously designed the steam turbine. So this form has a very sort of elegant aerodynamic form, which looks rather like a steam turbine, particularly with its lateral fins running up and down both sides. But I think the best way to imagine it is if you imagine a giant had taken a slice out of Coldlaw Hill and elevated it so that it points to the sun at its zenith on Midsummer's Day, which is due south. And if you were to push that elevated form, which is made out of Corten steel, back into the hillside, it would completely disappear because the topography of the hill informs that sculpture. So it's a very site-specific relationship to the land, but of course it also is a tribute to the Queen. It celebrates the Queen and the Commonwealth.
I noted there in the introduction, Simon, that 3 times the height of the Angel of the North, but of course Angel of the North, as you go up the A1, impossible to avoid it. This, can you see? Will you be able to see this from the main road to the borders, the one that takes you up to Hawick? Is it something you'll see, or is it going to be on because it's on private land, or will it be something you can't really see unless you're fairly close?
No, for sure. It is designed so that you can see it from the A68 running north-south from Hexham, as you say, up through to Edinburgh, albeit 3 miles away from that road. And as you grow closer along the minor roads, it'll get sort of bigger and change its perspective and things. But it's very much meant to be seen, but it's not meant to dominate the landscape.
And to be clear, I mean, I have to say, £3 million sounds a fairly modest sum to put it up. But you haven't raised the money yet.
No, I'm interested. I've read a few briefly a few bits of press today about 3 million. I don't know where that figure's come from. We haven't said it'll cost 3 million. It may cost more, it may cost less. I genuinely don't know because we haven't fully costed it out yet. That stage now comes as we have successfully gained this planning application. It's a long stage of detailed structural design and indeed fundraising.
Well, you've done well to get over the planning hurdle, that's for sure. I'm sure there'll be a number of construction headaches, but it's a really striking design. It'll be quite a view as you come over a hill or two to see that in front of you. Simon Hitchens, thanks ever so much for joining us, and good luck with that. It's a worthy project for all that sub-locals didn't like it, but then I don't have to live there, do I? They do. Simon Hitchens. We asked you a while ago about the prospect, potentially, of the Democrats suffering in Virginia, New Jersey. What does it mean, potentially, for that next American presidential election? Might Trump possibly be sniffing a return to frontline politics? A few of your tweets have come in. There's the poll. You quite like the idea, it would appear. Chris says, I miss Trump's late-night madness tweets. Well, I think he probably does as well, Chris, since Twitter have banned him. The world was safer with Trump in charge. Biden is weak and would sell out his country if he stayed awake long enough, says Harry. That's pretty harsh. Hank says he's never left Trump. He's living rent-free in the heads of the Democrats. Mark Dolan's next. Stand by.
Hello again. Clearing skies overnight will lead to a frost in places by Thursday morning. But despite the chilly start, plenty of sunshine throughout the day for many places. Not for all, though. We've still got a northerly wind across the country, high pressure to the west, and that northerly wind continues to feed some cloud and showers into mainly coastal parts of eastern England, as well as western England and West Wales. The showers in the north of Scotland, Northern Ireland, tending to ease away overnight, and inland, clearing skies will lead to those plummeting temperatures. We're looking at temperatures dropping to 3 to 6 Celsius generally, but in sheltered parts of England, Wales and southern and central Scotland, a few degrees below freezing possible first thing Thursday. But a bright start for many, plenty of sunshine. I think sunnier skies for central and southern England compared to what we saw through Wednesday. Still some showers feeding into the North Sea coast and West Wales as well as Cornwall. But on the whole, fewer showers compared to recent days, more sunshine and more pleasant feel. But still a gusty, cold wind and temperatures a little below average for the time of year, 8 to 11 Celsius. Some cloud then spills into the north and northwest of Scotland on Thursday night. That then eventually reaches Northern Ireland and southern Scotland by midnight. With that cloud, temperatures will hold up in the north, but further south, clear skies and lighter wind will lead to a more widespread frost. Lower temperatures as well, as low as -3 Celsius, I think, in some sheltered spots first thing Friday. But you can see the clear blue skies there across much of the south on Friday, and it stays largely sunny in the south throughout much of the day. But thicker cloud feeds into the north and more especially the northwest, where there will be some light outbreaks of rain. More unsettled weather in the northwest through the weekend, drier further south and turning a little milder for all of us.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.